Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. The International Monetary Fund serves an important role of promoting international macroeconomic stability. I recently had the pleasure of visiting Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, the site of the 1944 meeting where representatives from 45 nations gathered to discuss post-war economic recovery and ultimately resulted in the creation of the IMF. Over the decades, the IMF has grown, adapted, and changed. Our hearing today will examine the appropriate role of the IMF and how it has functioned through crises, including the global financial crisis, the Eurozone crisis, and most recently, the economic crisis brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. We will also examine how the IMF has evolved, including how recent developments in the fund's objectives may stray from its core mission as a lender of last resort and catalyst for reform in struggling economies. As the COVID-19 pandemic raged across the world, many developing nations struggled and turned to the IMF for assistance. The IMF abandoned the traditional and long-standing requirements, as the chairman noted, associated with its loans, offering no strings attached assistance. As the COVID crisis subsides, we must face reality. The IMF is a lending agency and must be repaid. Unfortunately, what began as an attempt to help struggling nations navigate the challenges from the pandemic has further fueled the IMF's mission creep away from its traditional role as lender of last resort into a politicized development organization. As we've seen with other lenders of last resort, such as the Federal Reserve, activist organizations and/or vocal policymakers are intent on using the COVID-19 pandemic as a smokescreen to corrupt the IMF into a no-strings-attached checkbook or focus it on matters outside of its narrow mandate. Last summer, the IMF approved a $650 billion disbursement of its special drawing rights so that developing economies could obtain hard currency and import medical supplies and personal protective equipment to combat the pandemic. While potentially well-intentioned, this allocation was troubling because it strayed from the core purpose of SDRs and awarded handouts to U.S. adversaries. SDRs are intended to address a long-term need in world reserves, not hand governments unconditional aid to boost emergency spending. Based on the SDR allocation formula, only 3% of SDRs end up going to the poorest nations. Meanwhile, other countries such as Mexico and Argentina admitted their money may not be spent to tackle COVID-19 as intended, but rather be used to pay off old loans or prop up struggling state-owned enterprises. Even more unsettling is the fact that these SDRs will go to countries like Syria, Iran, China, Belarus, whose brutal dictators are certainly not using them to purchase PPE for their citizens. Despite the misgivings by some Biden administration Treasury Department officials about the $650 billion SDR allocation, some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have called on the IMF to triple down with an additional $2.1 trillion no-strings-attached handout to countries like Russia and China. A portion of those SDRs is also being funneled into a new resilience and sustainability trust at the IMF, intended for climate change and public health loans, showing a complete lack of understanding or perhaps a blatant disregard for the true purpose of the IMF. This attempt to redefine the core mission of the IMF comes at a time when its leadership is mired in scandal. Last year, a bombshell investigation revealed how Kristalina Georgieva, formerly CEO of the World Bank, pressured her staff to manipulate data after Chinese officials complained their economy hadn't ranked highly enough in the bank's widely read and regarded Doing Business report. An independent report by law firm Wilmer Hale detailed the episode, and Ms. Georgieva now leads the IMF. Members of this committee from both parties expressed concern about the leadership at the IMF following these revelations. Republicans and Democrats can agree that strong, credible leadership at the IMF is necessary to ensure that the fund is able to sustainably navigate the future and operate squarely within its mandate. While we are at the crossroads in global competitiveness as China seeks to usurp the U.S. as the preeminent economic power, China's debt trap diplomacy has left many developing economies at the mercy of the Chinese Communist Party. There is little debt transparency about loans from China. I'm concerned that no strings attached funds from the IMF will be used to satisfy the usurious terms of Chinese loans to struggling economies, including through the Belt and Road Initiative. Congress should demand reform and accountability to ensure this is not the case. I fear, Mr. Chairman, that the IMF has lost its way. I hope the hearing today will inform us on how best to return the IMF to its core mission and ensure that it remains a tool for macroeconomic stability well into the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.